So I've been having this conflict with my brother, and now my parents have taken a side in it and just said, that we should just let it go and ignore his rude behavior towards me, which is deliberate and he has no problem with, in spite of the fact that I'm actually the one here who's trying to recover from serious trauma, but we all need to protect his right to be rude. Anyway, so enter the pandemic. So the pandemic hits and all church meetings go away until they end up going virtual. And so now we're not seeing any of my family in person because it's COVID, and Oregon was closed much longer than most places. And so we're not seeing them, and that's turning out to be a good thing for our mental health. But in the church meetings online over Zoom, they're still taking pot shots at me or at my husband. And my brother has had a couple of points where he's taken the opportunity to suggest very clearly and directly in public church meetings that Brian and the other elders are just preaching because they are full of themselves. No one says anything about how that's not an appropriate statement to make, to judge people's motives like that and slander them for nothing other than motive, which you can't prove. No consequences for him. He's just able to say what he wants, and everybody's writing it off as, well, that's how he is, and he's immature and he'll grow out of it and we should just ignore it and be the bigger person. So that's gone on for a while, and my parents are not happy with the fact that if my brother is present at an event that the family's invited to, that we won't come. Then the big crisis shows up. My brother, the older of my two brothers, and his wife, who live in New York, are coming to visit, and my mom wants to have all of her kids and grandkids all together for a family meal, even though she knows that we're not going to show up if Jay's there. Brian and I talk, and we are firm with our boundaries, and we go over to have a conversation with my parents. So we show up at my parents' house to talk with them and say we're not going to come to the family barbecue because Jay's going to be there, and he's bullying me, and he's bullying our kids, and he's harassing my husband, and we've confronted him on it twice, and he doesn't see a problem with the behavior, so we're just not going to subject ourselves to it, and so we can't come to this big family barbecue that you want to host, Mom and Dad. And my parents, we didn't give them all those reasons right off the bat, but they knew, because this is an ongoing problem. We just said we can't come to the barbecue, and at first they're like, oh, well, that's too bad, and then later they're like, oh, well, are you busy, or why can't you come? And we're like, and they say, are you not able to come because of what's going on with Jay? And we're like, yeah, that's why we're not coming, which they knew, but they wanted to try to find any reason to avoid the issue. They're like, oh, well, we wish you would just kind of get over that. And it was interesting because we were also having a conversation about Bible things, because my dad is a preacher and my husband was a preacher at the time. We were both preachers at the same church. And we're having a conversation because we're talking about the story of Tamar and how she was raped by her half-brother. And so we're just discussing this with my parents, and I'm pointing out that I've come to recognize that the reason sometimes those stories of horrible things that happened, the reason those things are included in the Bible aren't to show that the victim did something wrong, but rather because that's what happens in real life. A victim can be even doing something good, and wicked people take advantage of them, like is the case with Tamar and her half-brother. Her father even asked her to go over and take food to her sick brother, and her sick brother, being sick in the head too, takes advantage of the situation and rapes her. So she wasn't even doing something bad. She was doing what she was told to do by the king, by her father, and her brother took advantage of the situation. So there's no way you can say that it was her fault in any way, shape, or form, or that she was doing something wrong. And my dad has a hard time with that statement, that, she wasn't doing anything wrong, but she still suffered this. So there's two events here that seem unconnected, but you're going to see that they are connected. First is, we told my parents that we're not going to come to the family barbecue where my mom wants all of her kids and all her grandkids. We have all the grandkids, by the way. All of my siblings and myself. She wants us all to be there for this barbecue, and we aren't going to come. We've told her this because Jay, the younger of my two brothers, is going to be there, and he's a bully to me, and we're not coming. We also had this conversation we've had with my dad about how when the Bible records bad things happening to good people, it's not necessarily because the good people did something to deserve it. The story's there to show us that sometimes bad things happen to good people because there are wicked people in the world. And it's not because the good person did something wrong. So as it happens, that night is our Bible study at church, which is over Zoom currently because it's the pandemic. And we are reading Genesis chapter 34, where Dinah is raped. And I didn't really want to go because I have grown up hearing, when this story isn't avoided altogether, I've grown up hearing people suggest that Dinah got raped because she went to the daughters of the land who were unbelievers, who were idolaters, and she shouldn't have been there, and that's why that bad thing happened to her. I've grown up hearing this. Given what I'm going through and what I'm sorting through with the sexual abuse I suffered as a teen and trying to sort through all of that, and the guilt I carried and shame I carried for so long that shouldn't have been mine to carry, I just don't even want to be at church that night because I just think I'm going to lose my brain. My mind's just going to explode if somebody gets up there and says that it was her fault. So we start into the chapter, into the Bible study, and my dad goes on a rant and says Dinah allowed herself to be seduced by this guy Hamor, and she was complicit in her own rape. And my daughters are in the room. There's a dead silence after he finishes his rant because, he went on a tirade and nobody's really quite sure why, except Brian and I. We know what this is about. This anger is from the fact that we are telling my parents, no, we're not going to come to this barbecue, but he's taking advantage of this verse as a way to be angry and to put a dig into me about my situation and how I was abused. And I'm just, wow. So the room's silent. He's gone on this rant and nobody says anything. There are 5 other elders present who could say something and no one says a thing. My husband, who is the youngest of these men in the room, pipes up and says, what you are saying has no basis in either the Hebrew translation or in the context. Dinah was raped and it was not her fault. And awkward silence again. Meanwhile, my daughters and I, this is all over Zoom, so we're watching a screen and this is all happening, right? And we're hearing from a screen. My daughters and I are shocked. My girls are just trembling, terrified, upset. They've watched their grandfather get livid about this issue. And then he just said something really horrible about what happened to Dinah, that it was her fault. Meanwhile, I am in the midst of a full panic attack. I don't even know what to call it, but I was trembling. I was literally shaking with all the emotion of, wow, I can't believe my dad just said that. But I knew it was coming. That's the kicker, right? Is I knew something like that was coming because we had told my parents that we weren't going to come over and this was not okay. And the fact that I knew it was coming, hindsight now, I look back and I'm like, I knew it was coming because I knew I wasn't safe with them. Anyway, so the meeting continues. Nobody else says anything. They just move on and keep discussing other stuff in the chapter. Moving on like nothing happened. And I excuse myself and church ends. And it takes me like a full half hour to get control of my body again so it's not just shaking with rage and fear and whatever else. And I finally tell my husband, I'm going to go over there and talk to him because my dad and my mom lived next door at that time. I said, I'm going to go talk to him. And he says, I'll go with you. So we go. So we go up and I knock on my dad's door and he opens it. And he's just looking at me like, oh, nothing happened. Like he hasn't just half an hour ago in our church Zoom call stabbed me in the heart, literally, with his statement that Dinah's rape was her fault. And he's just looking like his normal self, like nothing's wrong. And I'm standing there and I am barely holding tears back because this is my dad. I have only ever directly challenged him once in my entire life, and that the one time I ever did something he was not happy with and stuck with it was when I met Brian. I knew that Brian was the guy for me and I was going to date Brian. And my dad, one night when he realized that this was happening back at that point, he didn't speak to me for weeks, and I had to go and restart the conversation and fix things between he and I because he just went around in a huff, in a funk for weeks because I was dating somebody who he wasn't okay with. Anyway, I'm standing there in front of my dad And he opens the door like, oh, well, what's up? And I just look at him and I said, how could you say that? How could you say that Dinah was complicit in her own rape and that she seduced Tamar? How could you say that? My dad knew my story. I had told him what had happened to me. And yet he still got up and said that. And he didn't just say it like stupidly. He said it in such an angry, rage-filled way that there was no doubt in my mind that the reason he was saying it was because he was trying to jab at us. Jab at me. He wanted to wound. And I just stood there and I'm like, how could you say that? And so then he backpedals and tries to say, well, I mean, I didn't really mean she was just complicit or whatever, but she allowed herself to be seduced, and I can't even remember how many other words he came out with that basically meant that she had a part in it. And I just said, wow. I turned and walked away. My husband stayed just long enough to say, this is why there are problems in our relationship with you guys. I went back to our house. So the next day I woke up after I'd confronted my dad, and there was a WhatsApp message on our church WhatsApp group where he apologized for his behavior in the church meeting the night before and said that after several hours of talking with my mother, he finally recognized that, oh, actually what happened to Dinah in Genesis 34 wasn't her fault. She really was raped and she had no fault in the matter. And yeah, so he made this apology on WhatsApp, and he said that he planned to apologize in the meeting the next Bible study meeting. And he had also sent me a text and said basically the same thing. I'm sorry. After talking with your mom a lot, I realized that no, she wasn't complicit in it at all. It wasn't her fault. And what happened to you wasn't your fault either. It was mine and the man who did it, and that my dad wanted to come over to apologize to me in person. I couldn't manage that. I couldn't manage it at that point. My emotions were too raw. And so I told him, yeah, I can't do that right now. And he wanted to apologize to the girls too, because he realized that they'd heard it also, our daughters. I said, we can't manage that right now, I'll get back to you. So I thought about whether I was ready to let my dad come over and apologize in person to me after he said what he said about the abuse. And I realized, first of all, I have to say that is only the second apology I can ever remember my dad making to me when he's done something in a rage. But it was a very good apology. There was nothing wrong with the apology. However, the work I had been doing to understand abuse, to understand what happened to me all those years previously with other people, I knew that though I accepted the apology and though I forgave him in that moment, I still forgive him now. As in, I have no expectation of anything. My trust had been shattered completely by his behavior in a public church setting, no less. And sorry, my throat's really dry from talking and stuff, so but my trust had been completely shattered. His behavior that night broke me. And so after a day or two, as I gave myself space, I wrote him a note and said, I forgive you. Thank you for the apology. I will consider what you said. I forgive you. I do not trust you. And I don't know, said some other niceties, whatever, basic stuff. But the basic gist was, I need to see changed behavior, because words at this point mean nothing to me. That did not go over well. The very next Sunday that he was at church, after making his public apology, the very next time that he preached at church, it was about forgiveness and not being bitter. And for the next 6 months, between him and my brother, regularly they were talking about forgiveness and not being bitter and the anger in the family and the problem in the family, in church, in prayers, and in preaching.